It looks like it's working. Well, hey everybody, good morning. It's good to see everybody's faces. We've got the whole crew here. We got Woody and Rick and David and Darren. Again, you know, we keep everybody muted just so that we don't all try to talk at the same time, but we might unmute people from here, you know, now and again. So today we got kind of a lot to cover. There's a bunch of questions. We're going to talk about Milky Way stuff and why I've just kind of moved solely into Star Tracker territory to do that, and some techniques I'm using. And I'll give you a little bit of preview of some stuff that's coming in the Milky Way course before very long. And I also wanted to show you, Rick and I had an amazing trip in the Palouse. We were working on a video training series, sort of from the field to the edit, working in the landscape in the Palouse, and it was windy but beautiful. So I'll show you just a few photos that were fun and proof positive that you can hold down a big lens in high winds on the tripod setup that I love so much. So
yes, you can.
Yeah, why don't I actually? I'll start with that because it's kind of fun. We'll just run through a little bit here. I'm going to share my screen. This might just be amusing for everybody. So this is, if you wonder how windy am I talking about windy, this is how windy it was up in the Palouse.
Yeah. It's kind of windy here.
That's pretty windy.
Yes, it is.
And here is, I'll start with that because it's kind of fun. We'll just.
Of course.
Oh, we got you got.
That was me. I don't know why it does that.
I love this little scene right here. This is Rick dropping his stone bag because he has the older style leveling adapter with the handle that goes down, and he needed a big rock, which he carried about a quarter mile down a road. This is using the new GoPro 9, which I got, which I'm also just blown away impressed by with both its video and its audio. So there's this.
Don't drop it.
Boom.
It was a big rock.
All right, and then showing I've got my 70 to 200 on my 500 AH at 200, filming him from a little distance. I'm not going to put the audio from that is just horrible, but I think you get the idea. It's nice and smooth. So, you know, all this stuff really does work in pretty darn horrific conditions. And I'll just show you a little preview. We're thinking we'll probably do another Palouse workshop next spring. It's so fabulous there. I'm just going to run through a few of the images. You know, this is a place. We're on the backside of Steptoe Butte here, and the cloudscapes are just so beautiful out there. And basically, you drive up this big butte, and there's all these overlooks that just put you out, you know, high up. We had a beautiful sunset the first night. It was just spectacular. It was so windy, but just beautiful. What a night. And you're up over this high farm country. You drive these roads through it. Clouds are constantly changing. There's all these just kind of amazing farm roads to just tool around looking for the right clouds and light. And then you go up on Steptoe at sunset and sunrise, and every time it's different. You know, the clouds and the light, and they just play these awesome shadows. This is at 500 and really high wind on the 500 AH with the big stone bag. Amazing thunderheads in the distance. We didn't have any light that night, but the clouds just lit up. The towns are cool. There's an old Hudson parked in Palouse, which was kind of fun for me. I haven't even really gone through and done anything but a tiny bit of raw processing on any of these, but it was a heck of a nice trip, and just nice to be out and hanging out together. You know, both of us are past 2 weeks vaccinated, and there's that eclipsed moon. This is a vertical panorama. It was hazy. There wasn't any light because there was clouds to the east as the sun was rising and the moon was setting in the west. But it was still cool to be out there. Again, windy. And then the sun got through that little crack and threw those beautiful rays out to the east. It was just a great trip all the way around.
Yes, it was.
So let's talk, oh yeah, the last shot of the trip. This is early, you know, there was so much haze from the wind blowing so much of that silt. That's how those hills formed. But then as it got really low, it started to kind of clean up a little bit. And there was one nice shot at the very last shot before we headed home. Anyhow, so, you know, when I started doing star stuff, this is way back. This is more than 20 years ago, I think, in Death Valley. This is medium format film, and it literally was just an experiment with some Provia film in a Mamiya 645 and leaving it open for 4 hours while I slept in my tent. Right as the moon set, I started it, you know, to silhouette that Joshua tree. And, you know, that's kind of what you could do back then. I remember being really enamored with Art Wolf's Star Swirl images in Namibia and just thinking, oh, that's really cool. And then I got my D700. And all of a sudden, you know, I realized I could shoot images, you know, at night and get pinpoint stars. And, you know, I was really, really happy with this result. It's a little bit of a blue hour image. But, you know, as time goes on, you know, I started doing some light painting. Here's my good friend John Eastcott shooting up in the bristlecone pines above the Owens Valley with the Milky Way, you know, and it's pretty noisy, and those stars aren't pinpoint. This is still D700, 12 megapixel files. I remember having just kind of a happy accident where we had a little LED lantern, you know, a couple 300 yards away on the beach in the Olympic Peninsula. My good friend Andy and I were doing this backpacking trip and filming some stuff on one, and it just lit the foreground rock a little bit. But you know, the problem is still with these, they're not quite pinpoint stars, and there's a lot of noise. You know, to print, it gets kind of rough. This is a composite. I started thinking about shooting the foreground, you know, at the last bit of light, blue hour, and getting a high, you know, good definition, high quality foreground, you know, at a lower ISO, and then waiting and doing the Milky Way and compositing them. This is in the Alvord Desert. I did some stuff for some commercial clients back when I was doing more of that kind of work. This is for a big off-road truck accessory company. You know, and then out in Patagonia, you get into these starscapes. I was constantly looking for the kind of work though that you could print. On this trip, I tried a bunch of star stacking, where you shoot, you know, you shoot a dark slide. You'll shoot sort of like you were shooting for long exposure noise reduction. You shoot with the lens cap on for, you know, the same exposure that you think you need for the Milky Way, and then you shoot a whole rapid series of, you know, of images of your scene at a lower ISO, a shorter shutter speed, a little bit underexposed, and then you stack those in star stacking software, or at a higher ISO, shorter shutter speed to try to get pinpoint. And, you know, I got some nice results that I liked, but still it's kind of a pain, and it's really tough compositing stuff. You know, here I've got to go back in and get where those are streaking because it's, you know, blending. And then, you know, finally, I got the star tracker. I bought a star tracker. I bought the iOptron Skyguider Pro, which is a really great star tracker. And if I wanted to do deeper space stuff with longer lenses, that's the one I grab. You can even put a counterweight on it, like a telescope, and hold down a big, long, heavy lens to do deep space stuff. But it's a real pain to set up. And I've learned you kind of need to set it up during blue hour and stay fixed to that spot. Because the minute that it gets really dark in the Milky Way, it's hard to identify which one's Polaris as you're setting it up. It's a real pain. I'll show you in a minute live why I think that is. And then I got the Move Shoot Move star tracker, which is what I used here. And, you know, it's just kind of a different ball game with the Nikon's 20 millimeter 1.8 this is, and shooting the foreground with this one we light painted. Actually, this is down with Charlie Johnson. Down near Brookings, where we're going to be running a workshop in August. And I know some of you are in that workshop, and we will go back to here. And you know, I put a lume cube behind this little rock pointed out that way to just kind of create a little drama. And we took a bunch of test shots and figured out the exposure, and then, you know, start the move, shoot, move, and shoot space, and then shoot for the foreground and composite those two. And the problem with that in this particular scene is the compositing was so difficult because of the shape of these rocks. It really wound up just being kind of a nightmare. And in the future, what I would do would be shoot the foreground and then move someplace where there's nothing obstructing my view of the Milky Way, but it's that same Milky Way scene, and shoot it. And then it's much easier because you don't have the blurred rocks trying to blend into the sharp rocks with these shapes and patterns. It just made it so hard, the trees and everything. And then finally, I think I got my final run, having done some studying and thinking about all of this. I'm just a big fan of the natural light on the landscape with the Milky Way. So I was out at Mount St. Helens a few weeks ago, maybe 2.5 weeks ago, with my good friend Dan Hawk and some other fun guys. And we set up, and at Blue Hour, I found this composition that I really liked, and I just kept shooting it, you know, at like a 400 ISO, long exposure, like 4 minutes. And I put long exposure noise reduction on. Now, we'll talk about that in a second, but what long exposure noise reduction does for you is it takes another 4-minute exposure. So you take a 4-minute exposure, then it takes another 4-minute exposure, and it compares the two and eliminates any dead pixels, hot pixels. And hot pixels are just the sensor having a problem with overheating while it's on for too long. And it will vary in different humidity and temperature conditions. So it's not something that's going to always be the same with your camera. So it really needs to check the conditions at the moment of the exposure. And that's stuff you can do in post-production, but it's much easier to just do it in camera. So, you know, what we've got here is a 4-minute 400 ISO foreground with a 4-minute 400 ISO dark slide afterwards. So 8 minutes to take this foreground picture. And I'm looking at the histogram, just like you'd look at a daylight histogram, and making sure that all my data is in there to expose. And it's the very last bit of Blue Hour. And then I just moved to where I had an unobstructed view of the Milky Way. And I really liked this scene at 20 millimeters for the foreground. It just brought the mountain in a little tighter with the trees, and the volcanic, you know, the eruption blew these trees apart. So you've got the kind of detritus from the eruption in the foreground. And it's, you know, nice and clean and sharp as you look at it. And then for the background, I wanted to get the whole Milky Way. So I switched over to the 14 to 24 at 14. And these are both horizontal shots. So it's basically a panorama. It's two 46 megapixel images blended, and then just composited them together. And you can do that in ON1, or you can do it in Photoshop. It's not very hard in either one. I'll talk a lot about that in the course that I do. And it was kind of fun because the Milky Way in reality was, you know, the way I could line up for this particular scene, it kind of came down into the mountain. And I liked this scene better. And Portland was kind of backlighting on the horizon, a little bit of a glow in here. And so blending the actual galactic core right into that glow from Portland worked really, really nicely. And this is really what I personally want to be focusing on in the future, is the ability to get a naturally lit foreground exposed really well, really clean, printable, and then get, you know, with the new lenses and sensors that we have, those pinpoint stars. This is at 500 ISO, and it's a 90-second exposure with the 14 to 24. And it's just so clean to start with. Now, I'm going to jump out of here. One other thing that I noticed in doing the post-production on this, you know, we've talked a little bit about DxO Pure Raw and Topaz Denoise, and ON1's coming out with No Noise AI. I ran these images through both Topaz Denoise and DxO Pure Raw. I don't have a good working copy of No Noise AI quite yet, but I liked what Pure Raw, I like Pure Raw better. I liked what Pure Raw did for the foreground image, and I ran with that for the foreground image. It really cleaned things up and left me tons of detail and saved me a lot of work doing noise reduction. But I didn't like what it did to space, not one bit. You know, if you think about it, these pieces of software are somewhat processing your raw file and generating a new raw file that's a little bit processed. And when it comes to a scene like space, it created these kind of smudgy, weird, almost like color noise patterns in the empty part of space that I couldn't get rid of no matter what I did. with noise reduction. And isn't something you'd ever see on Instagram or Facebook or your computer screen at fill the screen, but it's something you see zooming into 100%. And that means it's something you're going to see if it's printed big. So I did not use that on the image of space. So that's kind of where I'm getting to with doing this star stuff. And I'll talk really quickly about what I really like about the Move Shoot Move. Aside from the fact that the device weighs about a pound and fits in this little case, I like the fact that you can move with it. I don't think they named it Move Shoot Move because you can move positions and get different compositions at night. I think originally it had a little bit of a time lapse type feature where it would move, shoot, move, shoot, move, shoot. But for me, it's named really, really aptly because if you use the Ioptron Sky Tracker or the Sky Guider, you basically, anytime you want to move, you have to take the tripod off. There's kind of a telescope that runs through the center of it and look through this illuminated reticle with it turned on. You get a little red crosshair and you get this magnified view of the stars. And at night, when it gets dark, what you see through it are a gajillion bright points of light wherever you point it. You can kind of get it lined up, but trying to figure out which one's the North Star is something I haven't been able to do very successfully, except during blue hour where the Big Dipper and the North Star stand out so much brighter than all the other stars. When the Milky Way is happening, it's really, really difficult to move with this thing. And it weighs about 4 times as much as any of the others. Or as the Move Shoot Move. With the Move Shoot Move, I can literally pick it up, move, flip on the little, whoops, I gotta get that locked in. Turn on my little laser, point it up into space, and just position it on the North Star, locked done. It takes like 20 seconds. You just position that little blade of lightsaber-like light right on the North Star, and you're positioned. I've got some kind of notification going on, sorry guys. Anywho, so it just winds up being something that you can deploy from your bag really simply. You don't need the base like you do for the bigger star trackers. You have to have that custom base setup that gets you the right, inclination. It's kind of basically a pan and tilt mechanism, but it's designed to fit in it. This guy, it just locks into you can put an Arca clamp on it. It's just a little square brick. I mean, it's really not very big at all. You need a second head. I like a ball head to be able to move around wherever I want. And I put a Kirk Arca clamp on it. And this whole thing is really small. Just like that. So the laser has a rechargeable battery. This thing has a USB-C port on it and recharges. You can run it off USB-C power. I tend to like to run my camera off USB-C power when I'm doing this stuff. That way I don't have to worry about batteries during the night since the new cameras run off USB power. One other thing, if you're working in a condition with high humidity or with where it's cold out, having one of these little lens warmers, I've got links to all this stuff on my ATS link site. But if you get the right power delivery power brick, you can plug the lens warmer into that and the camera into it, drop that in your stone bag. And then once you've got your whole shot set up, you just wrap your lens with this guy and it just keeps it warm so you don't get condensation when you're shooting, down into the middle of the night. And that's been the trick for me doing Milky Way stuff and star stuff. I know that some of you guys, Charlie's been out shooting with me, Rick's been out shooting, doing Milky Way with the star tracker. You have any comments to add to that, Rick?
Just that the Ioptron was unbelievably hard to try and find the North Star. Once it gets dark, I mean, it really, you can't go anywhere with it once you set it up.
You can't move. Yeah,
Right.
Once you're set up and rooted in space. And the other thing that the Move Shoot Move enables, for me, I really think it's important if we're thinking about doing these star tracker things, you're also going to be compositing. And if you've got a complex foreground that's beautiful, like that seascape that we showed that I shot with Charlie, you don't want to try to composite an image that's got that blurred in the foreground. You want to shoot that nice and sharp with the camera rigidly locked on your tripod. No big deal. You shoot that during blue hour. You shoot it down until there's just almost no light left. You make sure it's sharp. You zoom in, preview your image, make sure you got it sharp, relatively noise-free, keep it down in like 400 ISO or below. And then you go, and I mean, you can shoot 4 minutes, you can shoot 10 minutes. The new cameras are amazing. Just turn on your long exposure noise reduction and sit back and enjoy a tasty beverage of your choice while the 8-minute exposure or 20-minute exposure happens. And then when it's completely dark, you turn on your red light, you get your move, shoot, move set up, you move up to a hilltop where you've got an unobstructed view of the Milky Way, you shoot your Milky Way, and that way the stars and everything are what they were that night. You can position it like it was, but it's going to be so much easier to composite with a clean star field and then your foreground to lay on top of it.
So we had a bunch of questions about long exposure noise reduction, and almost all of them were, it drains my battery, why should I do it? All of that sort of stuff. And we've worked in the field quite a bit with long exposure noise reduction. I think both of us are fairly comfortable that in most situations, it really helps us, especially with this type of stuff. You have anything else to say about that? I mean, people really do seem to be either afraid of it or feel that it isn't worth the time.
You know, I think that depending on your camera and depending on the situation that you're in, you know, if you're out in the desert and it's 90-degree night and you're doing 90-second Milky Way exposures on the star tracker, you're probably going to have a whole bunch of red hot dead pixels and blue and green dead pixels strewn all through your image that are really a pain to go in and fix in post-production. You could take, well, it's the same thing though. I mean, you could take multiple exposures, they'll shift a little bit and try to get rid of it with star stacking software, but that's going to be a pain still. I mean, you still are taking multiple exposures. It makes your life in post-production much, much easier. I'm going to say that when it comes to the star photos. When it comes to the foreground photos and you want to amplify starlight on your landscape, you know, you can't shoot an early blue hour image of the landscape and blend it with the Milky Way to make it look natural. It needs to kind of be mostly starlit. So it's going to be the last part of blue hour. And I mean, I'm finding at 400 ISO, it's like a 5-minute exposure with your camera pretty wide open. One thing I forgot to mention too, your lens is pretty wide open. And so for that scene that I shot, let me pull that up. That's a thing I forgot to mention in this. That's one more complication. This scene right here of Mount St. Helens, let me go bigger. I focused on this dirt around the stump, this area right in here. I focused on that and I took a frame, 5-minute exposure, 5-minute long exposure noise reduction. Maybe it was 4 or 5 minutes. And then I focused on a star for the infinity shot of the mountain and the trees further behind it at 20 millimeters. It was at 20 millimeters. And did another image, and then I focus blended those two. So I did some focus stacking. It's 2 shots, infinity and the foreground, because with your lens wide open, if you have an interesting foreground, you're not going to be able to get everything sharp and in focus from the mountain to the foreground. So, you know, depending on your particular image, if you have things that are closer than an infinity and you don't want them blurry in your really beautiful, you know, printable image, then you're going to need to do some focus stacking too, which compounds the thing. But honestly, I totally agree with Rick. I think that unless I'm doing some sort of time lapse or a pano where the light's changing fast and I need all the images to match, I'm going to go ahead and use the long exposure noise reduction, despite the fact that it takes me a little bit longer. So Rick.
What?
Yeah, next question.
Oh. So the scope with the move, shoot, move.
Mm-hmm.
You want to, this is something that's essential to working well with it, correct? Are there any reasons not to get it?
The scope. What do you mean by the scope?
The laser, the pointer.
Oh, the laser is just the key part of the whole thing. When you're out at night, the little laser on this thing is literally like this green, where did I set it? It's this green lightsaber that just shoots out into space. I mean, and it puts out such a bright dot in the stars that it's so easy to identify, and you just move this green line of light, make sure there's no planes in the vicinity you're pointing it, and set it on the North Star and click, and if you've got either the Acrotech pan and tilt head or the panorama head or a fluid head, it makes it so easy because you just move the pan to get left and right correct, and move the tilt to get up and down correct, and you set it on the North Star. And for wide angle work, that's good enough. There are some websites where you can figure out, maybe you should actually put it a couple of laser widths closer to the tail of the Big Dipper to get a perfect alignment, because Polaris is just a little bit off, but that's stuff you can look up. There's actually a cool app that I'm going to talk about when I do the course on how to get it just right. I mean, Al was getting. Oh, go ahead.
Charlie asked, could you use that laser pointer with the ioptron to help zoom in?
You could get, I'm not sure where you clamp it. I mean, you could rig some kind of a clamp where it's probably aligned with it pretty close, but it's still just hard to tell. I know you've looked through it, Rick. Whenever you get to a field of stars, they're magnified and you can see so many stars in it. I mean, it's tricky. It's a tricky one. And there's no place to mount it really close to the axis of rotation. The ioptron's so much bigger. This is so much smaller. It's pretty close on the axis of rotation. I actually have talked to Move Shoot Move, and they were doing some stuff where they had a polar alignment scope to try to get even more accuracy, and I really didn't like it. I wouldn't suggest you get theirs. But I talked to them and I said, if you guys really want to get into that game, you should build a bigger one, that's slightly heavier, like the ioptron, that has a central polar alignment guide that also has the laser, so you can hone in on it, nail it with the laser, and then perfect it. And they said that they would totally think about that. So hopefully they'll be coming out with one of those. I don't know. That was my suggestion to them.
So a couple people talked about weight and Move Shoot Move. Carl said he's concerned about the weight that the rotator needs to support.
I wouldn't use it with my 70 to 200. I have no problem with it with the 20 millimeter or with the 50 millimeter 1.8 or with the 14 to 24. It's been just fine. You mount it on there snug. It isn't built for doing deep space stuff with 500 millimeters. That's for sure. If you want that, you should really be doing the ioptron. Or a telescope, a bigger telescope with a camera mount to it.
Right, but that's a whole different thing. That's
a whole can of worms, exactly.
Let's see. How about filters? Any of the light pollution filters, do they help? Do they do just? Andrew asks, is it simply a color balance correction or specific wavelengths of light blocked by the filters? Do these filters increase the chance of coma around stars?
So filters opens up this whole new subject. I haven't made the big general announcement, but I talked to Hoya last week, and I've been talking with Case. And I think, I know a lot of you have Hoya filters that I've recommended over the years, and I love my Hoya filters still. I'm not ditching them, but Case has come out with this system that is so easy to use, and they immediately came out with things for the Nikon 14 to 24, along with Nisi, which has become kind of my favorite lens for a lot of landscape work and star work. And Nikon built this kind of incredible system for the 14 to 24, where you just, it's a nice small lens, and then it comes with this big gargantuan hood that you can slip on it, but it isn't very heavy. And that thing takes 112 millimeter filters. Well, if you put one of Case's magnetic rings in here, which I have, you can just magnetize. This is a pack of 6 of their 112 millimeter filters. And one of them that I love and that I used in that Mount St. Helens shot is their neutral night, and it just click, you're in. So it's such a simple system, easy to stack. easy to use. And yes, I think that the light pollution filters, Hoya has the, it was a color intensifier filter. I think they've renamed it for Star Work now. I still have it's the same filter, the intensifier. The Nisi has one as well that works really, really well. Cases is fantastic.
Natural light is the Nisi one.
The Nisi one, natural night. None of them are particularly cheap, but they make a big difference when you've got light pollution. So they're actually adapted from welding goggle glass originally because it blocked the sodium vapor that can blind welders. And it's funny, they originally, the filter companies, I think it was maybe Hoya first, realized that, you know, if you put that out in front of your camera, it intensified reds and pulled back on some of the blues and greens. And so it made fall colors look amazing. So they called it a color intensifying filter. The funny thing is then they realized that at night it blocks sodium vapor. And even though we're moving into an LED world, most of the rural areas and a lot of the city lights all over the world are still running sodium vapor. Street lights, barn lights out in the middle of nowhere. A lot of the light pollution coming up is sodium vapor. And you get that kind of dull, greenish brown haze along the horizon. And these things just really clean that up. You get a much more defined stars and Milky Way shooting with this than without, and it doesn't affect your exposure at all. So, you know, my tendency is to slap that on there when I'm doing the star work. It works really well.
Do you do anything with respect to white balance in general in camera?
You know, I set somewhere around like 4,500, something like that. I'm shooting raw. It doesn't really matter. I used to make things really kind of bluish purple. I think you could see that in some of the images that I was showing back when I was earlier doing Milky Way. And, you know, that was also back when I was just oversaturating everything in my mind. You know, it seems like the longer I go at this game of photography, the more I go back to my old images and pull saturation way back and adjust the color balance to look more natural to me. I think I was really enamored in the days of Fuji Velvia at the end of film when I got into digital and I was kind of oversaturating everything I did color. So, you know, these days I'm looking for a real natural looking night sky. I don't want it too purple magenta. I don't want it too warm. I want that kind of nice natural look. And that's something easily achievable in post. So I generally set a Kelvin white balance for like 4,500 just to get a good look on the back of my camera, and then I'll adjust it in Lightroom or in On1, depending on what I'm using.
So a couple of other sort of Star Tracker questions, like would you use the Star Tracker? I mean, we're talking about Milky Way mostly, but you know, would you use Star Tracker for eclipses or for shooting the moon, or you know, what other things would the move shoot move or the other one be useful for?
That's funny. I saw that question about the moon. And the funny thing, I don't think people always think about this, is that the moon is lit by daylight. So whatever part of the moon is lit up is your kind of, you know, is your 250 f8 rule, right? I mean, it's brilliant sunlight. There's never clouds on the moon. It's being lit directly by the sun. And what you're seeing is the shadow of the Earth across the moon being lit by daylight, or no shadow of the Earth when it's full. So it's basically daylight settings are what you want for the moon. It's not a long exposure to capture the moon. And so I can't see needing a tracker to do it. The move shoot move has a moon setting. And I suppose if you threw a whole bunch of neutral density on, you could blur the foreground and have the moon tracking in your frame, but I can't see the utility of it. So, or maybe you're doing a time lapse of the moon moving, in which case, but no, still you want the moon moving. I don't see the utility of it. Solar eclipse, it's usually from a very fast shutter speed to a slower shutter speed, but still nothing that the sun's going to blur. When I shot the total solar eclipse, you know, I was reading all of the online stuff. We ran a workshop and I had a bunch of great people in it. And, you know, I had never shot a total solar eclipse. I just did a lot of research and we all went out to do it together. And the research, you know, was all kind of, I think, based on film. A lot of the people who put out the most well-read articles and tutorials on shooting eclipses were talking about, you know, 10 frame bracketing and all this stuff. I mean, I wound up using 3 frames. It was on the meter, 3 stops under, 6 stops under was fine for the whole
Yeah.
diamond ring. The new sensors are just so much better than film was. They can capture everything that you need. And none of them were at any kind of speed where I would need to track it, even with the long lens, even where it was just filling the frame at 800 millimeters, was fine. So
There were a
I
bunch of
think.
questions. Just
Oh, go ahead.
what was that?
No, nothing. I
Oh,
didn't mean to-
there were a bunch of questions about timers, and there's nothing really magical here. It's find a timer that works for your system,
Mhm.
and
What? So you mean as to just triggering a very long exposure?
yeah, a bunch of people had questions about how to use a long exposure timer, all that sort of stuff, and it really does come down to either setting it on your camera for a very long timer, 10 seconds or so, or whatever sort of external device you want to use.
So I back in, there's one really nice thing in the new Z cameras is the ability to do up to 900-second exposures. That's only on the 2s, but you can go into your settings, and there's extended shutter speeds, and you can go all the way to 900 seconds. That's a long time. So that's a really, really nice feature where I'm not using a timer very much with the new cameras. Right. I really, really enjoyed the Foolography Unleashed with my Z6 and Z7. There's a little funky thing with the Z6 II and Z7 II that they haven't quite addressed yet. They need to upgrade their app because it tends to not allow you to preview images after you've shot with it. It's not bothering me that much because I don't need it with the Z6 II and Z7 II with those extended shutter speeds. One wonderful solution, and that David Archer bought for me as a present, he's such a sweetheart, years ago, is the Pluto Trigger. The Pluto Trigger plugs into whatever accessory port is on your camera, and then it sits in the hot shoe, and it has a nice app. It connects via Bluetooth. It has a battery inside it that you make sure is charged up before you head out. You can also run it off of a battery bank like we've been talking about. And it has all kinds of things it'll do for the camera, including really long exposures. You just set it, hit a button, and there's a nice countdown timer in the app. It also will do, lightning triggers and things like that. Although I didn't have the best of luck with it, trying that with Al. I think that maybe the move shoot move was obstructing it though. When I was in Florida, we kind of gave it a shot. So I think that you can also just get a good intervalometer that you can set for however long you want the exposure to be in its bulb mode with the wire plugged into your camera. Set it up and hit start on that. As long as you have whatever way works for you.
Okay. So if you're not using a star tracker,
Mm-hmm.
one question from someone on YouTube is, can I just use photo pills and point it to where it says to start out? I'm just getting started with shooting the Milky Way.
If you're just getting started, you can go through the same bit of process that I have, and then maybe you don't need big clear prints. Maybe you just want something that looks great on Instagram and looks wonderful on your screen to share with others or send in emails. And the way I started, the old school rule back when we had 12 megapixel cameras was the 500 rule. And I taught that for a long time. You take your focal length and divide it into 500. If you're shooting with a 50 millimeter lens, 500 divided by 50, you get 10 seconds as the exposure for pinpoint stars. Well, the problem is, as we get more and more megapixels and lenses that resolve better and better and better, you find that that's not really true. You zoom in and they're blurred, they're streaked, the Earth's rotation is affecting them, particularly up in the corners. And so then, star stacking software, if you really are starting to want to get perfect, there's Photo Pills has a mode that you can go into called, was it Pinpoint Stars, or it's called, I think it's there's in all of its settings, there's point stars or something like that.
Yeah,
and
they've got a star spotter.
Spot stars or something like that. You go into it and you tell it that you want to use the MPF rule. That's the newer rule that really gets you pinpoint stars. And then you can enter your focal length and the camera that you're using. So you say, maybe I have a Nikon Z7 II and I have a 14 millimeter lens, and it'll tell you 8 seconds. It's way less than the 500 rule yielded. And to get an exposure for the Milky Way, my baseline exposure is generally 30 seconds, 3200 ISO at f2.8. And you can adapt that. If you have an f4 lens, you have to go longer with your exposure or higher ISO. But to get 7 or 8 seconds with a good exposure of the Milky Way that's not underexposed, that's going to generate a ton of noise, you're going to find that it's yielding ISOs up in the 20, 30,000 range. And so you need to do something different. You know, you're either eventually going to be led to doing star stacking, which is taking like 10 shorter exposure, higher ISO images of the stars and a dark slide and feeding it into software, and then kind of masking in that software where's the horizon line, and then it composites all those images to build a longer exposure with less noise. And it does work well. It's just you know, it's a lot of work in my opinion. And then if you get the star tracker, you just for me it's just so easy to use and so nice. And then I can just shoot the foreground, I can shoot the stars, I blend those two, and it's really not as hard as it sounds. And I think it's taking me a lot less time, and I'm liking the results better. So that's kind of where I've come to with it. If you want to go out and start experimenting with the stars, by all means, shoot for that 30 seconds, 3200 at f2.8. Adapt that to whatever needs you have. You know, if you don't have an f2.8 camera, you've got to turn up the ISO a little bit, and you're going to get a beautiful image that if you zoom in, the stars are blurring a bit at 30 seconds, but it's still going to look beautiful. If you post it on Instagram, people are going to freak out. So there's no reason to not start experimenting with this stuff. But, you know, if you start wanting a higher quality image, this thing's like $200, and it really does. Well, and you need a secondary head. You can get a ball head someplace, a second ball head to put on it to just get your composition how you want, and it just turns to alleviate the Earth's rotation from blurring the stars in your image. It just tracks with the same way that the Earth's turning. Simple.
Yeah. So right now it's they're selling. You recommend the basic kit B, which includes the kit and the pointer. Right now it's $218 on moveshootmove.com. You can get it other places as well.
Okay, I think it was $199 when I bought it, so it's $218.
Yeah,
Everything.
A bunch of people have asked about specifically which version of that.
I link it. If you go to my website, and you go into the training section of my website at gear, and I go down to lighting and night photography, and if you hit that move shoot move star tracker, it lights up with kit B selected.
Yeah.
So, oh yeah, 218. There you go.
And I would second that. If you're just starting out and you're not even sure that night photography and Milky Way tracking is what you want to do, that trying some of the other approaches, are definitely worth doing, you know. Mm-hmm. And you'll either get addicted to it or you won't, you know?
Yeah.
So
it's frustrating in the beginning. You know, one thing we haven't talked about yet is focusing in pitch black.
Yeah.
And it's something that I used to say that was one of the things that kept me from thinking about mirrorless. Is, you know, in the earlier versions of the Sony A7s and the Lumix cameras that I tried and the Fuji cameras that I tried in the early days of mirrorless, I felt that focusing in the dark was just impossible. It was this noisy TV screen I was looking at. And now it's so much easier than it is through a DSLR. You know, in the days of DSLR and actual, connected mechanical focus rings, I would focus on infinity at blue hour and put some gaff tape on it so it couldn't move, you know, or you mark infinity on your lens at 14 millimeters by focusing on something and putting a little strip of pink gaff tape across and then slicing it so that they both rotate and you line it up perfect and you know you're at infinity. Because rarely do modern lenses actually stop at infinity unless you have a Zeiss. And so, you know, the focusing now with the mirrorless cameras, I find that if I could find a planet out there and I put my pinpoint AFS mode in my Nikon, and I know that the Sonys and the Fujis are just as good. You go over, you put it on a planet, you hit autofocus and you have the low light autofocus mode enabled in your settings, it'll slow everything down. It'll get really clear and bright looking in the viewfinder. It'll take quite a little time, say low light autofocus, and then whoop, it locks and gives you a green square. Shoot, zoom in, check. Wow, it just nailed it. If I have a problem, I can also look at it, and nowadays, you know, with my ISO low and I turn my shutter speed way up, I get a nice, relatively clean look at stars in my viewfinder. I find the brightest one in my viewfinder, move my focus point over it, hit the OK button with my settings the way I have them set. It zooms to 100%. I see this bright blob in my viewfinder, and I just slowly turn the focus ring to make it as small as I can. Move it past, move it back, move it past, move it back. That's as small as I can get it, shoot, and I'm also perfectly focused. You can do it manually. It's just amazing. For the foreground, turn on your headlamp, shine it at said stump, hit autofocus, bam, you know, done.
Charles asks about any ideas for shooting the Milky Way and stars with a tracker and including that image reflected in a still lake.
They're beautiful. I showed you one from the enchantments. You know, the Milky Way. It reflects at a little bit lower intensity, just like when you take a shot of a beautiful scene at sunset reflecting in a lake. You'll find that it's really nice to use the editing software's graduated filter to just brighten the foreground or darken the sky a little bit more, because it tends to be a couple of stops less intense in the reflection. You can do the same thing with your foreground with the Milky Way reflecting in it, and the starlight reflecting in the foreground is wonderful.
All right. What about panos or time lapse with these star trackers?
I wouldn't do time lapse with the star tracker. I mean, it's an interesting thought. If the camera is moving, keeping space still and having the world rotate around, and it might be an interesting kind of one-off to try. Maybe I will at some point, but you know, I mean, it literally would have the Earth tilting as space stayed still. It's worth an interesting try. For panoramas, there is a way. Where did I had this thing set out somewhere? Not sure where I put it, but I'm not going to go running around searching for it. It's a wedge. There's a plate that you can set on your star tracker when it's set up. And I'm not the hugest fan of them in general. I'm going to make this statement first. So, oh, I put it on backwards. There's a plate that you can put on here that has a hinge, and you can lift it up so that your head is level and it's rotating from down below. And the problem I have with it is that it reduces the stability of the system, so that if there's a little bit of breeze, everything's just a little shaky. You know, if there's even a little bit of wind, I don't think you're going to get as good a shot on it. It just feels like this is rock solid. It's not going anywhere. With that thing, everything just gets a little springy. Move Shoot Move sells them. I can't remember. It's like a V plate, and you just mount it to the thing. And it has a little lock pin. It'll rotate, so you can rotate back to get straight again after your shot. And then it has a platform that lifts up that you mount your head on, and then you could do a pano, you know, off your head while you're doing the thing. You know, it's complicated. Panoramas in star photography is complicated, no matter what. It's more complicated with the star tracker. I would work on first just getting good shots with your star tracker and going really wide so you get the whole scene that you want. I mean, with our sensors as big as they are now, I mean, 46 megapixels, you can do billboard size prints if you get the settings right. I think that I will showcase the wedge plate in the course that I'm doing, just as a kind of aside. Here's how you would set up a pano. But you know, the other thing is you're going to be doing 90-second exposure, 90-second long exposure noise reduction, 90-second. You know, maybe in that case you choose to turn long exposure noise reduction off so you can capture your pano more rapidly. But yeah, I mean, it's possible. It's just more complicated.
Anything about light pollution? You know, it's hard to grab the Milky Way downtown in the city.
Mm-hmm.
Correct?
Correct. It's
And I know there are a
hard.
couple of sort of light pollution map websites out there.
Dark skies. Um, you know, I think it's not. It's great to get out someplace where you're very far from the city. You know, Rick and I have Eastern Oregon out where he lives, and you get very far from one of the towns, and all of a sudden you got nice dark skies. The coast can often be nice where we are, probably not down in Southern California though. But in those areas between towns, I think that if you get a little ways out of town, you're going to have some night pollution, but experiment with it. You can go out and shoot the Milky Way not that far outside of town. You're not going to shoot it under sodium vapor lights, you know, in the industrial dock area of Oakland, you know, for example. It's lit up so bright, I don't think you could possibly see it, or down by the bridge in Charleston where David and I were. But if you drive half an hour out of town, you're going to have a glow on the horizon from the city, and you won't have quite as bright and intense a Milky Way as if you're out in the middle of Death Valley, but you'll still have the Milky Way. And that's a good time to start experimenting with these light pollution filters, these night filters, and see just how good they are at filtering it out of that background noise pollution. You know, one of the things that I found that's really interesting too with the star stuff is just thinking more about the noise that we're dealing with in these night images, and the fact that it really there's noise from long exposures, which is the hot pixels. You know, that's just like parts of the sensor malfunctioning as it gets too hot, and that's where long exposure noise reduction comes in and saves your bacon in post production by getting you a nice clean image that doesn't have that in it. And then there's just generalized background noise that's created even at your base ISO on your sensor, and it's overwhelmed by having a lot of data that just drowns it out. So there's a signal to noise ratio with your sensors, and the more you turn up the gain on your sensor, remember when we turn up ISO, we're not changing the sensor's sensitivity, we're just amplifying the signal that it brings in. And so when you amplify that signal, you amplify the background noise, and if you amplify it too far, it starts to overwhelm the image. And that's what happens as we ramp up our ISO higher and higher and higher. And so, you know, even as we're shooting at higher ISOs, we need to make sure we're getting enough signal to drown out that noise. That's why if you shoot Milky Way with a really short exposure at a little bit lower ISO or higher ISO, you wind up getting a little spike far on the left of your histogram in the blacks and the shadows. That's not very much signal. And so that background noise is getting amplified, but there's not that much signal to get amplified. That's why I'm talking about doing 4 or 5 minute foreground exposures where you're really amplifying the signal enough to drown out that just base background noise, even at a low exposure. Because I don't know if any of you have had an experience where you shoot something really underexposed at your base exposure, but it was really underexposed, and you go and you try to pull the shadows. And it's not just posterization where sometimes you can see, you know, the sky breaking down where you can see the difference between the different tones and there's kind of lines in your image, but there's also noise that blooms out of the shadows, even at your base ISO. It's because there's just an inherent relationship between signal and noise. You need to have a good enough histogram, enough data on that histogram that's starting to reach out and touch into the right side of the histogram in order to overwhelm just the background noise, even at low ISO. So you still want to be looking at your histogram. You also want to turn, if your screens don't have an auto monitor and auto EVF brightness feature, make sure you turn those on, because it's gonna help you not think that you've got a brighter image than you really do, and trust your histogram, not your eyes. When you're shooting that foreground exposure, you really want a histogram that's not that much different than daylight, a little underexposed, but not a lot underexposed.
Yeah. Couple of questions from YouTube. Do I need to have an f2.8 or 1.8 lens, or can I work with an f4? And can I use auto ISO?
No, I would not use auto ISO. I would use everything manual. And you're really gunning for that shot in the histogram for your foreground image. You're going to have a pretty dark image for the stars, but you're still going to have bright points in it. You know, with the star tracker, if you get a good polar alignment, you can do really long exposures for the stars in the Milky Way. Charlie and I were out on the coast, and the lens he was shooting with was the 14-30 f4. You know, and I was shooting with the 20 millimeter 1.8. And, you know, we would be making sure that we weren't shining lights for each other. And Charlie's exposures were, I think, 5 minutes long. Not if that's right, Charlie. 5 minutes long. So he had 10 minutes waiting for long exposure noise reduction. Mine were 90 seconds. You know, that's the thing that it's going to buy you with the star tracker is being able to work more quickly and being able to set up and do multiple different things instead of trying to get one shot dialed in that's a 10-minute shot. The other thing that I would say when you're setting up and you're getting your composition, crank your ISO up. Get ugly shots you'd never want to edit, but that you can see. You know, I'll run up to 64,000, 112,000 ISO and dial in my composition and make sure that it looks good. And even for focus checking, I'm going to run with a much higher ISO than I want for my final image. It's only when I got everything dialed in that I'm going to make sure, and I know I've got it right. That's when I'm going to really turn down the ISO and turn up the exposure length and go for that foreground shot or the star shot. I want to make sure that everything's right when I'm focusing on the stars, even, you know, I'm not going to turn up the ISO to the point where I can't tell if I'm in focus, but you can still tell if you're in focus at 6400 ISO. You don't need to be down at 500. And that's going to make it a lot quicker process to check and see whether you've got everything right or not.
Okay. Couple of people asked about the Move Shoot Move ZV plate. I think it's that plate that you showed me.
Yeah.
You got any thoughts about that?
Yeah, the only reason, that's what I was talking about. And I said it somewhere so that I could talk about it. And I wish I knew exactly where it was. Oh, you know what? I think, I don't know. It reduces the stability of the system. Like I said, I mean, it feels like a point that just adds flex to where your camera's mounted. You got a lot of weight sitting up on a little hinge, and it's just not as rock solid as putting your ball head right on this Move Shoot Move. And so the only reason I would use it is for a pano, because the only way I can think of doing a good quality pano on the ball head is to be able to rotate from level. And so, you know, I would flip this to where I'm mounting the camera right on the rotating, or the ARCA plate right on the rotating part, and get it leveled right here with that V plate, or I don't see a need for the Z plate, the V plate. And then you could do a panorama, because the problem is your head's all cattywampus over here, and trying to get a level panorama is just going to be really, really hard. So you could do it if your composition puts your camera perfectly level, but more often than not, you're tilted a little bit. That's the problem. You know, your composition doesn't necessarily have the camera dead level, so you can't put a panning clamp right under it, and you're going to wind up creating a rainbow panorama unless you have that plate and you can rotate underneath your composition. I know it may not make the most sense right now, but I'll show it in the video when I do the course, and I'll show you how the plate will let you do a panorama. It's still going to be a huge pain. It's not something I'd recommend for starting out. Okay. Just, you know, go wide. That's the reason Al asked why I used 2 different lenses in my composition of Mount St. Helens. And the reason was that I liked the composition of the mountain in my foreground at 20 better than at 14. The mountain looked tiny and very far from those logs that had blown down in my foreground. But then I didn't have enough of the Milky Way to make me happy at 20. So I just switched my background shot to 14 and blended the 2 together, and it was fine.
Okay. I think in terms of questions,
we're getting through them.
Okay, we've got a couple of longer ones that would take quite a bit more to answer. I guess one question that was asked was that I had totally forgotten about these, but you know, we used to have mirror lenses. You remember those sort of single aperture astro type lenses that were fairly cheap?
Yep.
But I haven't seen anyone use those in the field at all.
Well, you know, and I'm gonna make the little caveat here that what I'm after in my night and sky and star photography is taking landscape into the night. You know, it's combining that beautiful view of space that always has captured my imagination from the time I was a little kid, and being able to render it in a way that we can make a big print and go, wow, you know, to show that to people that weren't there. mean, that's kind of always been my drive in photography, is to have these adventures and just be taken aback by the beauty of the world, and then bring it home and share it with the people who weren't there. You know, and in my case, it was my grandmother, who lived to be 99. She had my mom when she was quite old, and she was just this adventurous soul. She you know, sailed across the Atlantic during World War I when she was a little girl, and she loved the adventures that I would bring home and share via the camera. And I think that was my whole start in photography. So being able to share those night skies with people in the city who don't get out to see it, maybe it inspires them to go out and see it and be more invested in protecting the natural world, or just being involved with it. It just makes me happy. So and I'm less about the deep space stuff. That fascinates me, but I'm fine looking at the photos that they're getting from the deep space telescopes, you know, and being wowed by it. And some of my people in the community that have their own observatories and are shooting with really long lenses and telescopes, you know, I love traveling, seeing things that are amazing, being able to bring back that landscape under stars with the Milky Way. That's what gets me excited. So that's more what we're talking about here, less than deep space. And those mirrored lenses are big, long lenses that could be fun for deep space stuff. But I think you're probably looking for a different discussion if you're looking for nebula, and all that kind of stuff.
Okay. Okay. Well,
Do we want to talk about next week just a little bit?
Oh yeah, we're gonna do a gallery for the 2 weeks.
Or
right?
not next week, but the next office hours.
Yeah,
22nd.
next office hours, 22nd.
3 weeks. Yep.
We're gonna do a long exposure
Mm-hmm.
photo gallery. You can either submit your best recent shot, or take some of this and go out and do some night photography, some other long exposure stuff during the day. Submit them to us, and we'll walk through the gallery and take your general questions.
Yeah, and it can just be your favorite long exposure image. If it's something captured recently, all the better. But you know, go ahead and throw us something that you really like. We'll run through those and talk about them. Beyond that, I've got a trip coming up to New York right after that. I'm excited. We're going to go see some family, some of the kids' cousins, and it'll be fun. We're going to spend a few days in Manhattan. My birthday's coming up in that period, and I haven't been there in way too long, so I'm excited about that. And we've got the Coast workshop kicking off in August, which I can't wait to get back out with the group having fun. And we're going to do a bunch of star photography in that. I know some of you are in that, so I'm looking forward to that. All right, everybody. It's been a fun hour. It's good to see everybody's faces. I hope people have had an opportunity to be out shooting in good weather, and we'll see you all in a few weeks.
Take care.
Thanks, everybody. Bye, guys.